The trauma bay at St. Augustine Memorial smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee, the same way it did every night that summer. And Maya Voss moved through it the way she moved through everything now. Quiet, efficient, invisible. She had been a nurse there for 11 months. Nobody asked where she came from before that. Nobody asked because nobody cared enough to wonder why a woman with hands that steady, a woman who could start a central line blindfolded, was mopping up after residents half her skill and twice her arrogance. That was fine with her. Invisible was the point. "Voss, room 4 needs vitals," said Dr. Elliot Graham, not looking up from his chart, the way he never looked up when he spoke to her. Graham was the attending on nights, a man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of confidence that came from never once being wrong in front of people who mattered. He had decided within her first week that she was competent but unremarkable, a serviceable pair of hands, nothing more. She let him believe it. It was easier than the alternative. "On it," she said, and went. The night had been slow until 11:40, the ordinary parade of broken wrists and chest pains, and a man who swore his indigestion was not a heart attack until the monitor told him otherwise. Then the doors blew open, and the slow night ended. 2 gurneys came through fast, paramedics shouting vitals, blood already pooling through gauze, and behind them a third patient walking under his own power, with his hands pressed to his ribs, refusing a wheelchair. "Multiple GSW, possible altercation outside the Rourke Street bar," the lead medic barked. "1 critical, 1 stable, 1 ambulatory but complaining of rib pain." The bay erupted into motion. Maya moved with it, checking the ambulatory patient first because that was her assignment, cutting his shirt open with trauma shears, watching for the telltale bruising pattern of a fractured rib. That was when it happened. A single sharp crack sounded from somewhere outside, muffled by walls and distance, easy to mistake for a car backfiring on the street below. Most of the staff didn't even flinch. Maya went still. Not frozen the way fear freezes a person, not the wide-eyed paralysis of someone caught off guard. Still the way a hunting dog goes still. Her head tilted a fraction of an inch, her eyes fixed on nothing. Her breathing suspended for 1 full second while some old, buried part of her brain did math nobody else in that room knew how to do. A second crack followed, then a third, spaced with a rhythm that felt deliberate. A young nurse named Priya elbowed her coworker and smirked. "Look at Voss," she whispered, not quietly enough. "She looks like she saw a ghost." Another nurse laughed under her breath. "Probably never heard fireworks before," someone muttered. Graham glanced over, amused despite himself, the corner of his mouth curling into the kind of smile reserved for people watching someone else be small. "You all right there, Voss?" he asked, not unkindly, but not kindly either. "It's just noise outside, not our problem." Maya didn't answer right away. She was still counting. 4. A pause longer than the others, then a 5th, sharper, closer. Then silence. The room had gone quiet around her without anyone quite noticing it happen. The kind of quiet that gathers when something in a person's stillness makes other people uneasy, even if they can't say why. Priya's smirk faltered. "Voss?" Graham said again, sharper now, less amused. "I asked if you're all right." Maya turned to face him, and her expression was not the expression of a frightened rookie. It was the expression of someone doing triage in her head. 5 rounds, she said. Semi-automatic, not fully automatic, spaced with deliberate trigger control, not panic fire. The 4th shot had a longer gap, consistent with a shooter reacquiring a moving target rather than emptying a magazine blind. The room did not laugh. Nobody said a word. "The report signature," she continued, quieter now, almost to herself. "The pitch, the decay, the spacing. That's a 9mm, most likely a Glock 19 or something in that family. Not a rifle, not a shotgun. And the shooter paused between shots 4 and 5, which means they were tracking something that moved. That's not random violence. That's controlled fire. Graham's mouth had opened slightly, and nothing came out of it. Priya's smirk was gone entirely, replaced by something closer to confusion bordering on fear. "How?" Graham finally managed. "Would you know that?" Before Maya could answer, the ambulatory patient on the gurney in front of her, the one with the cracked ribs and the shirt she had just cut open, turned his head and looked at her properly for the first time. His face went through several stages very quickly. Disbelief, recognition, something that looked almost like relief. "Doc," he said. "Doc Voss?" The word landed in the room like a dropped tray of instruments. Every head turned. "You've got to be kidding me," the man said, and there was a rasp in his voice that came from pain, but also from something like awe. "Kandahar, Fob Marlowe. You pulled shrapnel out of my leg while the whole world was on fire around us. I never forgot your hands. Steadiest hands I ever saw." Maya closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. When she opened them, something in her had shifted. Some latch she had kept closed for 11 months quietly coming undone. "Hello, Reyes," she said. Graham looked between them like a man watching 2 languages he didn't speak being translated in real time and understanding neither. "Someone want to explain to me what's happening," he said. Nobody answered him because at that exact moment the second gurney, the critical one, began to alarm. The monitor above patient 2 screamed a rhythm that didn't belong in a living body, jagged and irregular, and the numbers dropped in a way that meant the man on that table had somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes before his heart stopped being able to save itself. Graham spun toward it, all bravado replaced instantly with the focus of a man whose job this actually was. "Talk to me," he snapped at the resident nearest the bed. "Blood pressure's crashing. 60 over palp. Heart rate 140 and climbing. Breath sounds diminished on the left. Chest tube now." They moved to insert one, following protocol exactly as it was written in every textbook Graham had ever taught from. It didn't work. The tube drained a small amount of blood, and then nothing. The patient's pressure continuing its slide toward 0, his lips beginning to take on the blue tint of a body running out of oxygen it couldn't circulate. "Pressure's 50 over nothing," the resident called out, voice climbing toward panic. "He's crashing." Maya was already moving, not asking permission, not waiting to be told. "That's not a simple hemothorax," she said, coming around the bed with a speed that made the resident step back on instinct. "Distended neck veins, muffled heart sounds, tracheal deviation. That's tamponade. His pericardium is filling with blood and squeezing his heart to death. And a chest tube in the pleural space isn't going to touch it." Graham rounded on her, old habits reasserting themselves even in the chaos. "This isn't your call, Voss. Step back." "Dr. Graham," she said, and her voice had changed entirely, flattened into something with no room left in it for deference. "If you don't needle that pericardium in the next 90 seconds, this man dies on this table, and everyone in this room will know I told you so." It was the tone that stopped him more than the words. It was the tone of someone who had said sentences like it before, in places where the stakes were exactly this real, and there had been no attending physician above her to defer to. Reyes, from his gurney, managed one word. "Listen to her." Graham looked at the patient's face, gray now, sliding toward the specific stillness that meant a body was giving up, and something in him made a decision faster than his pride wanted to allow. "Do it," he said. "Whatever it is, do it." Maya's hands moved before the words had fully left his mouth. "I need a spinal needle, an 18 gauge, and someone to spike a bag of saline in case I need to convert to a window. Move his monitor leads to alligator clips. I want to watch for ST changes on the needle. Somebody get me an ultrasound if we've got one in the bay. I'm going subxiphoid, 45-degree angle, aiming for the left shoulder." The room, which moments before had been laughing at her, now moved to her orders like she had always been the one giving them. A nurse who had smirked 10 minutes earlier now handed her the needle with hands that shook slightly, not from doubt, but from the electricity of watching something rare happen in front of her. Maya found the landing spot with 2 fingers, steadied her breath the way she had steadied it 100 times before, intense lit by chemical light instead of fluorescence, and pushed the needle in. "Watching for blood," she murmured. "Watching for ST elevation. If I hit ventricle, we'll see it immediately." The needle advanced. The monitor held its rhythm. Then, with a give that only someone who had done this before would recognize as good and not catastrophic, the needle broke through into the pericardial sac, and dark blood began to fill the syringe. "There it is," she said, quiet, almost gentle, the way a person speaks to something they've been waiting a long time to find. "60 cc's out. That's the tamponade releasing." The monitor's screaming rhythm began, slowly, to organize itself. The blood pressure climbed, 60, 70, 80 systolic, the blue draining from the patient's lips like watching a photograph develop in reverse. "Pressure's coming up," the resident said, disbelief thick in his voice. 90 over 60. He's stabilizing." Maya withdrew the needle with the same unhurried precision she'd used to insert it, taped a small dressing over the site, and stepped back only when the monitor had settled into a rhythm that no longer looked like a body trying to die. Nobody in the trauma bay spoke for several seconds. Graham stared at the monitor, then at Maya, then back at the monitor, as though checking that the numbers hadn't been some kind of trick. "That," he said slowly, "should not have worked that fast. That's not standard protocol. Standard protocol is imaging first, cardiothoracic consult, controlled environment." "Standard protocol," Maya said, "assumes you have time you don't have." He had 90 seconds, maybe less. Imaging would have killed him. "Where did you learn to do that?" Maya looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face suggested she was deciding, right there in real time, whether the 11 months of hiding had finally run out of road. "Somewhere protocol wasn't an option," she said. "Somewhere the only equipment I had was what I could carry on my back, and the only backup was whoever was still standing." Reyes from his gurney laughed once, a short, exhausted sound that turned into a wince from his ribs. "She's being modest," he said. "Everybody meet Major Maya Voss, combat surgeon, 3rd Special Forces Group. She ran forward surgical teams in places that don't show up on maps. I watched her do a field thoracotomy on a guy who'd already flatlined twice, with a leather man and a chest tube she made out of IV tubing. Man walked out of that valley on his own 2 legs 8 weeks later." The room's silence took on a different quality now, the silence of people recalculating everything they thought they understood about a person. Priya, who had smirked, who had whispered about ghosts, stood frozen with her hand still half raised from passing an instrument, staring at Maya like she was seeing her for the first time, which, in the ways that mattered, she was. "You said 5 shots," Graham said slowly, the pieces beginning to assemble themselves in his head. "Outside. You counted them like they were something you'd trained for." "I have," Maya said. Sound discrimination under fire was part of the job. Knowing what you're dealing with before it comes through the door is the difference between a team that survives contact and one that doesn't. You learn the acoustic signature of everything. Rifles versus pistols. Suppressed versus unsuppressed. Panic fire versus controlled fire. It's not a party trick. It's how you know how many minutes you have before the wounded start arriving, and what kind of wounds to expect. "And the shooting outside," Graham said. "You think it's connected to this?" "I think," Maya said, "that whoever did this to Reyes and the patient on that table wasn't finished when the ambulance left." As if her words had summoned it, the emergency doors at the far end of the bay opened again, This time not for a gurney, but for two men in dark jackets who moved with the unmistakable economy of people who had done violence for a living, scanning the room the way predators scan a field. Maya's spine straightened. Something old and sharp came awake behind her eyes. "Graham," she said quietly, without looking away from the men, "I need you to get security and lock the north corridor. Now. Not in 5 minutes. Now. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because what happened next was the kind of thing that decided whether Maya Voss stayed a ghost or finally became herself again." Graham, to his credit, didn't argue. He had watched her save a dying man in under 2 minutes using a piece of medical judgment most surgeons never developed in an entire career, and something in him had recalibrated permanently. He grabbed a phone and barked an order to security, while the two men in dark jackets stopped just inside the doors, eyes moving across the bay with slow, deliberate menace. One of them, older, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had made peace with doing terrible things a long time ago, found Maya across the room and smiled without warmth. "Major Voss," he said, "it's been a long time." The room went cold around that voice, the way rooms do when something arrives that everyone can feel is wrong even before anyone explains why. "Colonel Ashford," Maya said, and there was nothing in her tone but ice. "You're a long way from wherever they've got you hiding these days." "I heard a rumor," Ashford said, stepping further into the bay, ignoring the security guard now hurrying toward him, "that a former officer of mine was working under an assumed identity in a civilian hospital. I had to see it for myself. Frankly, I'm disappointed. All that training, wasted on broken wrists and rib fractures?" "What do you want?" Maya said. "I want you to come back," Ashford said, and something in the flatness of his delivery made it clear this wasn't a request being offered out of sentiment. "There's a program off the books. They need someone with your particular skill set, someone who's proven she can perform miracles with nothing. You walk out with me tonight quietly, and everyone in this hospital gets to keep breathing the same air they were breathing this morning." Reyes, still on the gurney, tried to sit up, ribs be damned. "Doc, don't," he said. "You don't owe him anything, not after what happened at Rashim Valley." Ashford's eyes flicked toward Reyes with something like irritation. "Sergeant Reyes," he said. "Still alive, I see. Shame." The word landed like a slap, and Maya's jaw tightened. "What happened at Rashim Valley," Graham said slowly, "wasn't her fault, was it?" Maya's eyes didn't leave Ashford. "For 11 months," she said, "I believed it was. I believed I made the call that got 4 of my own people killed in that valley. I believed I misread the terrain, misjudged the timeline for evac, and that 4 soldiers died because I hesitated for 90 seconds too long. I carried that. I left the service because I didn't trust myself to make that call again. I came here because I thought if I stopped being a surgeon who made life and death decisions, I couldn't get it wrong again. And now," Ashford said, almost bored, "you're going to tell everyone in this room a different story. Because that's what this is, isn't it? Confession hour. I requested air support 40 minutes before the ambush," Maya said, her voice climbing. Not with panic, but with the precision of a fact finally being spoken aloud after being buried too long. "I have the timestamp memorized. 40 minutes. It never came. I was told command denied the request due to weather. There was no weather that night. I checked later quietly when nobody thought I'd bother. Clear skies over the entire province. Someone denied that air support on purpose, and 4 of my people paid for it, and I spent 11 months believing it was my fault instead of yours." The silence that followed had a different texture than any silence that had come before it in that trauma bay. Ashford's face didn't change much, but something behind his eyes did. A small flicker of a man realizing the ground he was standing on had shifted without his permission. "That's a serious accusation, Major," he said. "One you can't prove." "I don't need to prove it to you," Maya said. I need to prove it to myself. And I just did, because you're standing in a hospital in the middle of the night, threatening a room full of civilians to drag me back into whatever program needs a surgeon willing to keep her mouth shut. That's not recruitment. That's damage control. You're worried about what I remember." Reyes, weak but grinning through the pain, said, "Told you she'd figure it out eventually." Ashford's hand drifted, almost casually, toward the inside of his jacket, and the second man beside him mirrored the motion. And for one suspended second, the entire trauma bay understood exactly how close the night had come to becoming something far worse than a shooting outside a bar. Security arrived at that moment, 3 guards, and behind them, 2 uniformed police officers who had been called for the original shooting victims and had simply never left. Maya didn't wait for the standoff to escalate. She stepped forward, putting herself between Ashford and the patients on the gurneys, her voice dropping into the flat, immovable register of someone who had commanded people under actual fire and had no patience left for men who postured with power they no longer fully possessed. "You're not walking out of here with anyone," she said. "And if you draw that weapon in a room full of patients on monitors and oxygen lines, every officer in this building is going to have a very easy case to make. So here's what happens next. You leave, quietly, and I make some calls of my own to people who still remember what Rashim Valley actually cost, and we let the record finally catch up with the truth." Ashford studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies an opponent he has just realized he underestimated. "You always were stubborn," he said finally. "Fine. Enjoy your civilian life, Major, for now." He turned, gestured to the second man, and the 2 of them walked out past the officers, who exchanged uncertain glances, but had no charge yet to hold them on, though one of them was already speaking quietly into a radio, requesting a plate number off whatever vehicle they'd arrived in. The doors swung shut behind them. For several seconds, nobody in the trauma bay moved. Then slowly, the ordinary sounds of the hospital reasserted themselves, monitors beeping, a phone ringing somewhere down the hall, the low hum of fluorescent lights that had witnessed this entire scene without so much as flickering. Graham was the first to speak. "Major," he said, and there was no condescension left anywhere in the word, only something that resembled genuine respect trying to find its footing. "I owe you an apology. Several, probably. I've been treating you like you didn't belong in a room where real decisions get made. And tonight you saved a man's life doing something most surgeons in this hospital wouldn't have had the nerve to attempt. I was wrong about you." "You weren't wrong," Maya said. "You just didn't have the information. Neither did I want you to. I came here to disappear, not to be seen." "Why?" Graham asked. "Did you let yourself be a nurse when you could have walked into any trauma department in the country as an attending?" Maya looked at the monitor above the patient she had just saved, its rhythm steady now, its numbers ordinary in the best possible way. "Because a nurse doesn't have to make the calls that get people killed," she said. "Or so I told myself. But tonight I made the call anyway, and it worked. And for the first time in 11 months, I think I might actually believe I'm allowed to." Reyes, still on his gurney, waiting for his own workup to continue, said quietly, "You were never allowed to stop being who you are, Doc. You just needed a good reason to remember." Word of what happened in that trauma bay didn't stay contained to the people who witnessed it. By morning, the hospital administrator had heard 3 different versions of the story, each one somehow more dramatic than the last, and had personally come down to the trauma bay to find Maya, who was finishing her charting at the nurse's station, like nothing unusual had happened at all. "Major Voss," the administrator said, using the title deliberately, the way people use a title to signal that pretending is over. "I understand you had quite a night." "I did my job," Maya said. "Dr. Graham has already submitted a formal request," the administrator said. to establish a specialized trauma protocol unit modeled on combat casualty care principles, and he's requested you lead it. He was very specific that it needed to be you and only you. Maya set down her pen. He asked for me by name. By rank, actually, the administrator said with the faint trace of a smile. He kept calling you Major in the meeting. I think it's going to stick. That afternoon, Maya walked into Graham's office, the same office where, 11 months earlier, she had sat across from him during her hiring interview and watched him decide within 4 minutes that she was a competent but unremarkable candidate for a nursing position several rungs below, where her file, or had he actually read the deployment gaps in it, might have suggested she belonged. You called me by rank, she said, in front of the board. It felt correct, Graham said. I spent 11 months underestimating a combat surgeon because I decided her file didn't fit a story I already believed about her. I don't intend to keep making that mistake. The unit, Maya said. Tell me what you're actually proposing. A trauma response team, Graham said, trained specifically to handle the kind of injuries civilian protocol wasn't built for. Penetrating trauma, blast injuries, mass casualty triage, the sort of decision-making under pressure that takes years to build and that most of my residents will never see enough of in a civilian setting to develop properly. I want you training them. I want you leading them. And frankly, I want you making the calls. Because last night proved you make better ones under pressure than anyone else in this building, myself included. Maya was quiet for a long moment. There are things about my past, she said, that aren't finished yet. Ashford isn't going to let this go quietly. There's an investigation I need to open into what happened in Rashim Valley, and it's not going to be simple, and it's not going to be safe. Then we'll deal with that, Graham said, the way this hospital deals with anything difficult, directly and not alone. Something in Maya's chest, some knot that had been tied so long she'd forgotten it was there, loosened slightly. All right, she said, I'll lead it. But it's built the way I need it built, not the way a committee thinks trauma care should look on paper. We train for reality, not for liability. Agreed, Graham said. Completely. 3 weeks later, Maya stood in a conference room that had been converted into a training space. Whiteboards covered in diagrams of tension pneumothorax management and improvised hemorrhage control. A dozen residents and nurses seated in front of her, Priya among them, no longer smirking, taking notes with the intensity of someone trying to memorize a language she'd only just discovered existed. The difference between combat medicine and civilian medicine, Maya told them, isn't the anatomy. The body doesn't care what uniform is standing over it. The difference is time and equipment and the willingness to make a decision with incomplete information, because incomplete information is the only kind you're ever going to get. Protocol exists because it works most of the time, but most of the time isn't the same as every time, and it's the exceptions that kill people if you're not trained to recognize them. She thought briefly of the sound of 5 gunshots outside a bar on Rourke Street, of the 90 seconds she'd had to decide whether to trust her own hands over the standard textbook, of 11 months spent believing she wasn't allowed to be the person capable of that decision anymore. She thought of Rashim Valley and the phone call she had made 2 days after Ashford walked out of that trauma bay to an old friend still inside the system who owed her more than a favor, who had promised to quietly pull the weather logs and communications records from that night and get them into hands that couldn't be intimidated into silence. It wouldn't be fast. It wouldn't be simple, but it would be true. And after 11 months of hiding from a version of herself that had never actually done anything wrong, true was enough to build on. Dr. Voss, one of the residents asked, hand half raised, how did you know that first night, just from the sound? How do you count gunshots and know that much? Maya smiled, a small, tired, genuine thing. You train for it the way you train for everything else that might save a life, she said. You listen until the sound stops being noise and starts being information. Everybody in that room heard a bang. I heard a caliber, a rhythm, a story about what was happening 200 feet away, because somebody once made me listen until I couldn't unlearn it. That's not fear making you go still. That's your training doing its job. Remember that, all of you. The moment you go quiet in a crisis isn't always the moment you're falling apart. Sometimes it's the moment you're finally paying attention. Nobody laughed. Nobody had laughed at her in 3 weeks, not since the night the whole room had watched a woman they'd mistaken for frightened count 5 gunshots through a wall and turn out to be the only person among them who understood exactly what those shots had meant. If you found yourself holding your breath through this one, that was the story doing exactly what it was supposed to do. And there are more like it waiting for you. Like this video. Drop a comment telling us what you would have done in Dr. Graham's position, and subscribe if you want to see where Maya Voss's story goes next. Because Colonel Ashford is not a man who loses quietly, and the fight for the truth about Rashim Valley has only just begun. The investigation into Rashim Valley did not move quickly, and Maya had known it wouldn't, because bureaucracies built to protect their own mistakes rarely surrendered their secrets without a fight. It took 11 days for her contact inside the system, a communications officer named Delacroix, who had served 2 tours alongside her and never forgotten the night she'd kept his own brother alive, with a chest seal made from a ration wrapper, to confirm what she'd suspected all along. The weather logs from that night existed, unaltered, buried in an archive that nobody expected a nurse working the night shift at a civilian hospital to ever have the standing to request. Clear skies, exactly as she remembered. Visibility 12 miles. No storm cell, no sandstorm. Nothing that could explain a helicopter refusing to fly except a decision made by a person at a desk, somewhere far from the sound of gunfire. Delacroix sent her something else, too. Something that made her sit very still in the break room at 2 a.m, with her coffee going cold in front of her. A transcript. Radio traffic from that night, requisitioned under a records request nobody had bothered to flag as sensitive, because nobody in command had imagined the surgeon who made the request would still be alive to ask for it 3 years later. In the transcript, a voice she recognized as Ashford's own had denied the air support request twice, citing operational risk in a sector that satellite imagery from the same hour showed was calm enough for a training flight. It wasn't proof of malice. Not yet. But it was proof that the story she had told herself for 11 months, that she had failed her people, that her hesitation had cost 4 lives, was a lie she had been allowed to believe, because the truth was inconvenient for someone with stars on his collar. She printed the transcript and sat with it in her lap for a long time before she called Graham. "I need to show you something," she said, when he picked up. He met her in his office before his shift began, before the hospital had fully woken into its daytime rhythm, and read the transcript twice without speaking. "This is enough to open a formal inquiry," he said finally. "Military or civilian, either way, this is enough to force someone to answer questions under oath." "I know," Maya said. "I've already sent copies to an attorney who handles cases like this. Veterans advocacy, mostly. She says it's strong enough to make noise, even if the military tries to bury it internally." "And Ashford," Graham said. "What happens to him?" "I don't know yet," Maya said. "But I know what happens to me. I stop being someone hiding from a mistake I never made. That's not nothing." Graham studied her for a moment, the way he might study a diagnosis that had finally clicked into place after weeks of confusing symptoms. "You've changed," he said, "since that night. Not into someone new, into someone who stopped apologizing for who she already was." "That's the idea," Maya said. The trauma unit Graham had proposed took shape faster than either of them expected, largely because Maya refused to let it become another slow-moving hospital committee project, and because the hospital board, still faintly terrified by the story of Colonel Ashford walking into their emergency department with an armed escort, was eager to demonstrate that St. Augustine Memorial took security and readiness seriously. Within 6 weeks, the unit had a name, the Advanced Trauma Response Program, a budget, a dedicated bay, and a training schedule that ran twice a week for every resident, nurse, and attending willing to learn something Maya had spent a decade learning under conditions none of them would ever have to survive themselves. Priya became, unexpectedly, one of her most dedicated students, staying late after shifts to run through tourniquet drills and airway scenarios until her hands stopped shaking during simulations, until the space between recognizing a problem and acting on it collapsed down to seconds instead of minutes. "I laughed at you," Priya admitted one night after a session on massive transfusion protocol had run long, and the two of them were the last ones left in the training room, cleaning up mannequins and discarded gauze. "That first night. I want you to know I think about that a lot." "You didn't know," Maya said. "Nobody did. That was the point of hiding." "Why'd you stop hiding?" Priya asked. "You could have kept your head down. Nobody would have made you say any of it out loud." Maya considered the question longer than she expected to. "Because a man I saved years ago recognized me on a gurney," she said, "and trusted me before I trusted myself. And because staying quiet was starting to cost more than speaking up ever could. Hiding felt safe for 11 months. But safe and honest aren't always the same thing, and eventually the gap between them gets too wide to keep standing in." Reyes, discharged after 4 days and a course of antibiotics for a minor infection in his rib fracture, came back to visit twice before he returned to his unit, both times bringing coffee that was better than anything the hospital cafeteria offered, and both times finding Maya in the middle of teaching something to somebody. "You look like yourself again," he told her the second visit, watching her walk a group of residents through the mechanics of a needle decompression on a training dummy with the easy authority of someone who had done it under artillery fire. "I feel like myself again," Maya admitted. "It took a while." "For what it's worth," Reyes said, "I never doubted you. Not in Kandahar, not here. Some people are just built to hold a room together when everybody else is falling apart. You're one of them. Rashim Valley didn't change that. It just made you forget it for a while." Ashford did not simply disappear after that night, though he made no further attempts to approach Maya directly. Instead, 2 months later, a formal notice arrived at the hospital's legal department, informing them that Colonel Ashford, through counsel, was disputing certain claims that had apparently begun circulating through veterans' advocacy channels regarding an incident in Rashim Valley, and requesting that any hospital employee named Maya Voss refrain from further public statements pending review. Maya read the letter twice, then set it down calmly on Graham's desk. "He's scared," she said. "This isn't the language of a man who thinks he's safe. It's the language of a man buying time." "What do you want to do?" Graham asked. "Exactly what I've been doing," Maya said. "Nothing different. I'm not the one who needs to be careful anymore." The attorney handling her case, a sharp, tireless woman named Denise Okafor, who specialized in cases the military preferred stayed buried, filed a formal inquiry with the Inspector General's office 2 weeks later, attaching the transcript, the weather logs, and sworn statements from 3 surviving members of Maya's old unit who had never stopped believing something had gone wrong that night beyond simple bad luck. It would take months, Okafor warned her, possibly longer, for anything resembling accountability to surface. Institutions like the one Ashford represented did not move quickly, and they moved even slower when the truth threatened careers built on decades of unquestioned authority. But it had started, and for Maya, that was the difference between the version of herself that had walked into St. Augustine Memorial 11 months earlier, quiet and folded small and convinced she deserved the punishment of her own diminishment, and the version of herself standing now in a training room she had built from nothing, teaching a room full of people how to survive the unsurvivable. On a quiet Tuesday evening, months after the shooting outside Rourke Street had become a story people told new hires as a kind of hospital legend, Maya stood at the window of the trauma bay, watching the city lights blur against a darkening sky, and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply feel proud instead of afraid. Graham found her there. "Board wants to make it official next month," he said. "Director of the Center for Advanced Combat and Trauma Medicine. Full authority over training, protocol, recruitment. They're calling it your program now, not mine." "It was always going to be mine," Maya said, "the moment I stopped pretending it wasn't." "Any regrets," Graham asked, "about how it all came out? The gunshots, Reyes, Ashford walking in here like he owned the place?" Maya thought about the question for a long moment, watching a pair of headlights sweep across the parking lot below, remembering the particular silence of a room deciding whether to laugh at her or believe her. "No," she said finally. "It cost me the hiding, but hiding was never really keeping me safe. It was just keeping me small. I'd rather be seen and imperfect than invisible and comfortable. I spent a long time thinking silence was survival. It wasn't survival. It was just delay." Graham nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's finally understood something that took him far too long to learn. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm glad you stopped being small." "So am I," Maya said, and turned back toward the bay, where a new resident was struggling through a simulated airway scenario, and where her voice, calm and certain, was about to become the thing that steadied the room again, the way it always did now, the way it was always meant to.